Thank you very much. It's, as I keep saying as I come through here, it's really nice to be home. It was a long time ago that I was here, and little did I know that I would come back and be able to share whatever wisdom I have with you in this context. And I just have to say that much of my work that you've mentioned about Germany has not just got a professional touch to it. I have been happily married to a German for 38 years. We've produced 2 binational children, and both of which have German-American passports, and 2 grandchildren who will soon have the same, but they are all responsibly the product of a good relationship I have with Cecilia Kaufley, who is here today and was the head of the Oldenburg Center when my wife Marlies became the German resident, and the rest is history. So I just wanted to let you know that there's more to my relationship with Germany than Angela Merkel. Let's put it. I wanted just to talk to you a little bit for a few minutes about the topic itself, but I am not here to console you either. The topic is a tough one in the sense of Yogi Berra's famous statement about the fact that, you know, things are really hard to predict, especially the future. And I think that these circumstances are those that are such that we have difficulty knowing from one tweet to another what's going to happen on a given day. But bear with me as I try to roll back a little bit of the clock to August of 1974, which is when I arrived in Claremont. And I was in those years looking to understand the world that we knew then. Now, if you remember, that year, 74, was pretty packed. Richard Nixon, remember him, had just resigned. And that created a lot of cynicism about government. And I mention that because I'm going to come back to that a little later. Sometimes the old French proverb, the more things change, the more they stay the same, is sometimes very accurate. That came a year later, in 75, with the end of the war in Vietnam, memorialized by a helicopter over the American embassy in Saigon. The U.S. at that point, and while we were sitting here trying to make sense of it, was entering a phase of foreign policy soul-searching. As Gerald Ford, and then as you recall, Jimmy Carter, entered the White House attempting to deal with, I think, basically a case of domestic depression, as well as a foreign policy defeat. So 1974, 75, 76, when my years here weren't all that easy to deal with at that point. Relationships between the Soviet Union and the United States had been going through a very elaborate period of negotiations over nuclear weapons, called the SALT negotiations, while the future of Europe was being framed by something called the final act of the Helsinki Accords. And that put in place in 1975 what would eventually, 15 years later, lead to the unrolling of what was in fact thought to be the frozen tundra of the Cold War. Another thing that happened that year, in those years, was India became a nuclear power. And that was to have significant impact on Pakistan. And so you can see that the cauldrons at that point were already reaching a slow boil. There had just been another war in the Middle East in 73 in Israel. And there was a tenuous truce emerging there. And then Lebanon, if some of you remember, was about to descend into a bloody civil war which went on for the next 15 years. I say that in particular because one of the advantages of being here in those years was that I had some friends from all around the world, and one of them was from Lebanon. And we always thought about him as that happened in his own country. I think that studying international relations in the 1970s was really confronting what we thought was going to be a very long standoff between 2 superpowers. 2 scorpions in a bottle, we used to say, struggling to fight with each other in proxy wars around the globe. Soon, not very much later than 1977, 78, to include a country called Afghanistan. China was imploding. It was not yet on the stage as it is today. still involved with itself, but on its way to become a world force, which it is, of course, now 40 years later. Elsewhere, the Shah of Iran might have felt secure in his palace in Tehran in the mid-70s, but all of the Iranian students that I knew here and studied with confided that he was sitting on an uncertain throne, and a few years later, as you all recall, he was banished from the kingdom as a populist wave which created the Islamic Republic of Iran. In those same years, under the leadership of Helmut Schmidt in Bonn and Giscard d'Estaing in Paris, Europe was gradually beginning to explore its economic capabilities as an expanding community, later to call itself, of course, the European Union. Like Europe, Germany was still divided, but the leadership in Bonn was looking for ways to talk to East Germany, and of course, decades after decades of trying to ignore each other. Even the United States had just established in 1974 diplomatic relations with the GDR. What I mean by this is simply to say the world seemed like it was locked in place in those years that I was here. But 15 years later, things changed. The post-World War II era seemed to be about managing that order, which seemed to be firmly anchored in a continent that was divided, and finding ways to avoid nuclear war. And I could read you some of the books that I was reading here in Claremont at the time, which made those assumptions about the world being, in effect, frozen in this tundra of the Cold War. But little did we know what would happen in 1989. By the time I left Claremont in 1977 to go back and work in Germany, there were signals that the clash between Moscow and Washington were going to get worse. Soviet missiles were being installed in Eastern Europe, and a crisis was brewing over how to respond to them. A crisis which would then threaten nuclear brinkmanship and would critically shake the transatlantic relationship to its core. So things weren't all that rosy then, just as they're a little bit troubled now. Still, the main questions we wrestled with here was, how would we manage this so-called bipolar world? How would we balance order and stability? How would the Cold War be kept cold? What realities had to be recognized to achieve that goal? The military balance of power was flanked by a recognition of restraint, diplomacy, and the duopoly of power between the Soviet Union and the US. And there were precious few other actors on the stage at that time that could challenge that. That has changed too. But that situation, of course, then we knew, perhaps we should have known better, was not sustainable. Not many would have believed then that within a dozen years the Soviet Union would be no more. Germany would be united, and Europe would embark on a path leading to a community of today, 28 member countries, maybe 27 in a year or two. We'll see what happens. I did not believe any of that. I thought that the things that I saw in front of me were going to stay that way. There were too many seemingly safe assumptions about the global balance of power, the challenge ahead, and the choices that were available at that time. For one thing, in my then state of mind, I believed that Germany was looking at a very long road, perhaps even a permanent division. The main goal, of course, was the importance of preventing a nuclear war. Within a decade after 1990, when we thought that the world was going to come together and Europe was going to be whole and free, war in fact returned to Europe and in the Balkans, to be specific. Within that following decade, war came to the shores of the United States in the form of 9/11 and spilled back further in the Middle East, where tensions were already raging for decades. In the mix of this troubling decade, full of anxiety, another wave of economic fears and indeed devastation for millions, adding to the uncertainty of the future, washed over Europe and the United States. I'm talking about the Great Recession in 2008 and 9. And then came the current decade, which remains marked by random international terror threats, economic disparities, distrust of leaders. Remember what I said about Watergate? Parties and the media and many other institutions, all of which seemed less reliable than they used to be in the past. The world, as Tom Friedman says, was flattened. And there were multiple power clusters leading to what some people were to call the world as multipolar. Others called it nonpolar. And still other people called it multiple modernities. All of them communicating, clashing, and causing a world that looked like it was losing its moorings. Russia had emerged during the last few years to challenge the leadership of the United States, violating the cornerstones of European security in the Ukraine while intervening in Syria. China, clearly now on a path to challenging the United States in the Pacific region with its expanding military presence in the South China Sea, but also a global presence now throughout the rest of the world. Think of the introduction of the AIIB as a direct competition with the World Bank. Then there has been the continuation of the proliferation of nuclear powers and potential for more in the wings. So the international security environment of the world today looks more volatile in some ways than perhaps at any point since World War II. I told you I wasn't going to console you too much here. But let us look at the transatlantic relationship within this environment. Case in point, the European Union. Coinciding with its 60th anniversary last March, 1957 Rome Treaties, it seemed as if all of the high expectations surrounding a European project evolving into the greatest post-national experiment in history has been stumbling. And this just a few years after the European Union, if all you will remember, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Assumptions about the present and the future suddenly appear not to be very operative. The poster child, Brexit. The UK opting out of the EU. Who would have thunk that? But there were other political movements arising across the continent in a blowback against their own national governments, against Brussels, and even a few national governments, such as in Warsaw and in Budapest, using that anti-EU trend for their own domestic purposes. The euro crisis remains a slow boil with no real end in sight, given the continuing struggle to shore up not only Greece, but I urge you to watch Italy, and political backlash against other governments, including Germany, as sources of this crisis. Now, the flow of refugees into Europe has strained both the fabric and the cohesion of the EU, and now with the increased tensions between the European Union and Turkey, that might even put more pressure on Europe emerging from the cauldron of Syria. So, amidst these challenges, the political leadership in many European capitals has become fragile, as are their governing coalitions. Point in case, France. Point in case, Germany, coming up. This has largely to do with continuing economic stagnation in many regions, rising social tensions, and indeed, in some cases, an alienation from the democratic processes themselves, and an attraction to what some, and I'll point specifically at Budapest, call illiberal democracy, framed around populist leaders and a revived ethno-nationalism. Now, this is not all bad news. There are some good news. There are still many candidates waiting in line to become part of the EU, and Brexit may not necessarily be a contagious disease. But as Henry Kissinger has phrased the challenge in a very, I think, articulate way, he asked this question: how much unity does Europe need, and how much diversity can it tolerate? Or, put another way, how much diversity must Europe preserve in order to achieve a meaningful unity? That's a tough question. The great impetus of moving ahead to another chapter in Europe must seek more legitimacy than preventing a war or sustaining an economic standard of living if it is to be supported by the 500 million Europeans that live within the European Union at the moment. As the EU High Commissioner, or representative, I should say, Federica Mogherini said last year, precisely at the time when our citizens in the world need a strong European Union, the purpose and even the mission of our union is being questioned and even threatened. So let me add, the results of these French elections in the coming weeks and then the German elections 4 months from now will be decisive for the path of the EU ahead. So that's the European basket. Let me return now to the theme of the discussion with the emphasis on the era of Donald Trump. While Europe struggles with its challenges, the U.S. is also in the midst of a debate about itself, its responsibilities, and its priorities. You saw that unfold in the campaign leading up to November 8. We've just passed the 100-day mark of President Trump, but the impact on transatlantic relations is to be seen in two things: the changing expectations of each other and attitudes toward each other on both sides of the Atlantic. The contrast between the euphoria of the Cold War some 27 years ago with today's nervous, unpredictable, and uncertain environment is palpable on both sides of the Atlantic. Much of that mood stems from our inability to answer with adequate persuasion 4 questions which for decades seemed to be self-evident on both sides of the Atlantic. And they were where, when, how, but most important, why do Europe and the United States need each other today? Let's start with a cornerstone of transatlantic relations, a common defense. Now approaching its 70th anniversary, NATO, the most enduring alliance in world history, is under duress by forces coming from both sides of the Atlantic. Trump himself has called NATO obsolete. I just have to check the tweets to make sure that's still accurate, but nevertheless, we know that he has said that. And he handed Chancellor Merkel during her visit in March to Washington an invoice for overdue payments from NATO. Several politicians in Europe are also critical of NATO, largely because they don't like the asymmetry of the control of the United States. Now, neither of these attitudes are new in the transatlantic community, but they do reflect a need to define a 70-year-old alliance 27 years after the end of the Cold War with a new mission. And that mission has to be supported by the public at large. There are answers to these questions. NATO's former main adversary in Moscow has delivered some. It has Putin's Russia has asserted itself on the stage, challenging the dominance of the United States, including in Europe and elsewhere. NATO has been active in helping deal with Afghanistan since 2001, and the longest-serving country with the United States in Afghanistan has been Germany. So much for the bill. And has just reinforced its northern flank on the Russian border. The interests of the many of the 28 members of the NATO, soon to be with Montenegro, particularly in Eastern Europe countries, remains very strong. You may find that there are skeptics about NATO in France with Le Pen or with certain countries in Western Europe, but I can assure you that in the Baltics, running down through Poland, NATO remains extremely important. But the assumptions about a common strategy to meet these challenges are not so self-evident anymore. Some are being questioned in the White House itself. Therefore, the reference that you made before to some people in Washington who say, how come we have to bail everybody out? How come we have to be involved in all of these conflicts around the world? Why can't somebody else do that? Keep in mind, however, that while we talk about the era of Trump, it's more than that. It is an era which is not just his. It is an era of Putin. It is an era of Erdogan. It is an era of Xi Jinping. It is an era of Marine Le Pen, of Viktor Orban, of the next guest at the White House, Mr. Rodrigo Duterte from the Philippines, and of course, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Egypt. This is all their eras. It isn't just the Trump era. And one can add probably more names to that list. But what they all represent is a cumulative form of a backlash that they represent against the forces of globalism penetrating national borders and reaction to same. While the parameters of the Cold War never completely prevented arguments about these answers in the past, it's not like we all were one of accord this whole time. There were more often debates about tactics rather than strategy. As long as the Berlin Wall stood in place, one could afford debate, but it did not put into question why Europe needed the United States and why the US recognized its own interest in meeting that need. And throughout the first period of the Cold War era, the ability to enable a Europe whole and free to emerge, which it did, was based on that mutual transatlantic commitment to shared security, as well as shared economic interests. Indeed, I would maintain that the web of relationships across the Atlantic were and are deeper and wider than any other which the United States shares elsewhere in the globe. And yet today, in the age of Trump and his colleagues, and the mass refugee movements, and the terrorist activities around the globe, amidst so many other factors, we see a set of tectonic shifts occurring on both sides of the Atlantic, which are at once homegrown and also generated by our shared interdependence, and all of which demand answers to those four questions I raised before. Where, how, when, and why do we need each other in the 21st century? Let me take a few more examples to show you where these problems have arisen and basically call for more explanation. Let's take something like the TTIP debate. I think you're all aware of that trade negotiation that was going on between Europe and the United States, and by the way, between Europe and Canada. It failed because of the fact that the population in some of the respective countries, particularly Germany, could not be convinced that this was something that was in their interest. In the context of transatlantic relations, there are virtually no more barriers to trade, but the TTIP was designed to create even more transparency between the two economies, and it didn't work because people felt that it was not fair to them. There's lots of reasons for that, but I would just suggest to you that TTIP is a good example of the failure of political leadership to explain what's in the interests of the respective sides of the Atlantic. Not only was that a problem, you also now face very specific challenges to the quintessential, in my view, the quintessential manifestation of transatlantic relations and indeed globalized relations, and that is climate change. But you will now see, I think on both sides of the Atlantic, most of all on this side of the Atlantic, a reaction to the Paris Accords, and it's unclear as to whether the Trump administration will even remain signatories to that accord that was signed so recently. Why is that? One could ask. Dealing with Russia is a third area that is causing trouble across the Atlantic. The implication that Russia violated international treaties when it basically took over Crimea, and it seems to me that the reaction in Europe and the United States was somewhat different. And how we're going to deal with the ability to cope with a Russia and to some extent their efforts to reassert themselves on the global stage could conceivably be a problem across the Atlantic. And it's something that I think that is perhaps not only going to be in terms of the geopolitics of Crimea or Syria, but things like energy sources, as well as trade and, to some extent, sanctions. So I offer that as a third example of some of the perhaps tensions that are going to be across the Atlantic in the coming years. China, I think, is probably one of the more interesting areas of strategic discussion, because in many ways China has become such a major factor not only for the United States but also for Europe and particularly for Germany. The notion that we have strategic interest in the South China Sea and Germany has economic interest in China should overlap in terms of trying to figure out how we can best deal with the emergence of a much more omnipresent China on the world stage. But it's not clear that there's going to be synergy between Europe and the United States in dealing with China on a number of issues. There are some, but they're not all there together. And I would suggest to you that as we look at the ability to deal with what is inevitably going to be a strong factor on the world stage, not just in the Asia-Pacific, that dealing with this issue of how we deal with the move, the pivot, as we call it, to Asia, and how that impacts Europe, and Germany in particular, which is the largest market for China, how that's going to work out in terms of trying to find a common strategy to deal with China. So that's number 4. I want to say that there is a fifth, and it's a little bit more, if I can say this, philosophical in some ways, because what's, I think, in some ways a worry on the part of some people that I know on both sides of the Atlantic is the viability of the Western alliance, not in only the geopolitical sense, but also in the sense of shared values. Some of the most fundamental pillars of the West and of the liberal international order seem to be weakening. Adversaries of open societies are on the offensive. Some of you might have seen the effort on the part, for example, of Viktor Orban to close the Central European University in Budapest. Liberal democracies have proven to be somewhat vulnerable to disinformation campaigns in a kind of post-truth international politics. Citizens of democracies believe less than that their systems are able to deliver positive outcomes for them. And they seem to, some of them, increasingly prefer nationalist solutions, Brexit, and closed borders over globalism and open societies. Illiberal regimes seem to be on solid footing and act with assertiveness, while the willingness and the ability of Western democracies to shape international affairs and to defend the rules-based liberal order are declining. Perhaps we are on the brink of a post-Western age, one in which the Western actors who have been shaping international affairs may be challenged by others, even to the detriment of precisely those multinational frameworks which have formed the bedrock of the international order since 1945. Are we entering a post-order world? How this question will unfold is uncertain. I believe that in order to react to that, we need to have a new narrative, once again drawing on not only the players that put the international order we have known since 1945 in the global arena, but taking into consideration new actors, new influential actors of all sides into the discussion. In other words, if I was to take an example of that and say the Security Council in the United Nations doesn't look like 2017, it looks like 1945. And that may have to change with new reference points. But what has happened on both sides of the Atlantic over these past 40 years, I would say, has created the kinds of challenges that we face and will face for the foreseeable future. I think it's going back now to the EU to conclude. There's an obvious need for reform in the European Union. Possibilities are going to include some constraints on the immigration patterns that have emerged over these last 2 or 3 years. There's going to be a need to face economic realities. There may be a need to review the Eurozone. There's going to be some questions about how much more the EU can expand, certainly the Eurozone. And such flexibility in looking at the way Europe is going to look at over the next 10 years is going to be necessary. There is a limit, however, to what Europe can do if it is forced to operate in low economic growth. And that is something that is going to be extremely important in order to deal with the situation with the Eurozone question and, to some extent, some of these populist movements that are very contagious in Europe right now. There is a compelling case for close European-US consultation and coordination on the full agenda of global and regional issues, as well as relations with China, Russia, Africa, and the Middle East, of course. Consultations and collaborations can take place in NATO, in Brussels, in capitals, with the emphasis determined by what venue is likely to yield the best results. But history shows that the United States benefits from a close partnership with Europe. The real question is whether European governments will have the capacity and the focus to be meaningful partners. Let me close with a couple of thoughts as how America fits into this. Europe is America's most critical ally. No other region of the world shares such strong commitment to liberal democratic values, protection of individual rights, the free flow of goods, people and information, freedom of speech and religion, maintenance of a rule-based international system, none of which would be possible without EU-US cooperation. When America wants to accomplish anything internationally, whether devising a response to global warming, halting Iran's nuclear weapons program, Europe is the ally it turns to first. Indeed, everything of value that America has accomplished in the world since 1945 has been done with Europe by its side. A century before, Americans and Europeans would begin building the present-day liberal international order in the ashes of World War II, the great French chronicler of America, Alexis de Tocqueville, mind you, 1836, observed that the two continents can never be independent of each other. So numerous are the natural ties which exist between their wants, their ideas, their habits, and their manners. Simply put, Europe's unraveling would be one of America's worst foreign policy disasters. Europe's strength would, like it was in 1990, be its greatest strength. Let's hope that that works. Thank you very much for your attention.